Well, my name is Bente Nitz, and I'm an EPR administration and registration specialist at ecosistant. That means I'm responsible for executing registrations and quantity reports in multiple EU countries, and I will guide you more through the specific EPR-related articles in the PPWR today. But first, we want to get everyone on the same page and talk a little bit about what the PPWR is and why it is being implemented. So, what is the PPWR? It is the Packaging and Packaging Waste Regulation, and it is an update on the Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive from 1994. The difference from directive to regulation is that the regulation is directly legally binding for all EU member states, and it doesn't serve as a guideline anymore, but is legally binding. And it came into force in February of 2025, so this year, and now we are inside the 18-month transitional period that will, it will be an effective date will be the 12th of August 2026. So this is when we can expect the first obligations to apply to us. And a quick word about why the PPWR is being implemented. First of all, what is the goal of the PPWR? The goal is to define uniform standards for the entire EU market, to reduce pollution and promote a circular economy. And how this can be achieved, Tiana will present today according to 3 principles: reusing, reducing, and recycling, ultimately to pave the way for climate neutrality in Europe by 2050. So I hope now everyone knows what the PPWR is about, and we can get into our first topic of today. This is something we have received questions about in advance, which is why we cover it in a little bit more detail today, which are the roles of online retailers according to the PPWR. And we hope we can answer most or all of your questions today. First, a quick introduction to these roles to get ahead with some concerns that you might have. So what we mean by roles is business activities. So each role corresponds to having a certain business activity. We have heard in advance that the terminology can be quite misleading, and we agree with that. So we're going to try to clear that up today. I will focus on 4 important roles or differentiations between companies, and a 5th one that is also important to note. And one thing I also wanted to say in advance is that each company can have multiple roles. So you do not choose one of the roles as a company, but you check for every role whether you fulfill the criteria for it. And with that being said, we can get right into the most important one, which is the role of producer. So every company that is making packaging or packaged products available in the EU to end consumers is a producer. This is most often the case for B2C sales, but it is also sometimes the case for B2B. This can be if the business you are selling to is the end consumer. For example, if you're selling workwear to a company, they are not reselling this product or packaging. Therefore, the waste ends up there and the company would be the end consumer. The obligations that come with being a producer might already sound familiar to you from current EPR regulation. You have to register with recycling systems, or PROs, as we will call them today, in every EU country that you're selling to. You have to register with authorized representatives in all the EU countries where you're not established yourself. And this is ultimately to report your quantities in that member state and pay the corresponding recycling costs. But the role of producer we will cover in more detail later on. That's why we'll move on already to the other roles. What is important to note is that the role of producer can be seen as an overarching role. And if you fulfill the criteria that I just mentioned, it is most likely you will fulfill at least one of the following roles as well. So let's get right into the second one of today, which is the role of manufacturer. So as the name suggests, this can be the manufacturer of the packaging itself. But what is misleading about it is that this obligation will transfer to the company that is the brand owner of that packaging. So if you're a company who is selling product or packaging under your own brand, you will have the obligation of manufacturer even if you are buying the packaging from somewhere else. This comes with certain obligations that are listed here on the slide. So you have to file a conformity assessment, which includes a conformity declaration. This declaration of conformity includes things like the serial number of the packaging, your contact details, a statement where you agree to taking responsibility for this packaging, and also more details about the packaging itself. The next role that we want to cover is the role of importer. This importing can be seen from the perspective of the EU. So you are an importer if you import from outside to inside the EU. And this comes with certain obligations as well. You have due diligence obligations like checking the conformity assessment. You're obviously not allowed to import non-compliant packaging. You also need to keep the declaration of conformity available, even if you are not the manufacturer. And one other important aspect is that your company contact details need to be indicated either on the packaging or in accompanying documents. The last role that we want to talk about today is the role of distributor. And the PPWR defines this role as making packaging available in the EU, but not being an importer or manufacturer. So if you don't fulfill either of those two, you are likely a distributor. What that essentially means is that you receive packaging and product from within the EU and you sell that to end consumers. So you are still a producer, but not a manufacturer or importer. The obligations of distributors are mostly due diligence because the packaging has already entered the EU market and therefore conformity assessment procedure should have already been carried out. Like I teased earlier, there's a fifth entity in the supply chain that I want to mention quickly, which is fulfillment service providers. Since a lot of online retailers work with them, you can expect to get in contact about the PPWR with them because these have due diligence obligations as well. They are not allowed to cooperate with non-compliant producers. Therefore, you can expect to certify your compliance with your fulfillment service provider if you are working with one. To further illustrate these roles, we have provided an example. So let's consider we are an online shop based in Germany selling cosmetics to end consumers within the EU. And we do so under our own brand. And we receive our packaging and product from suppliers within the EU as well. What roles do we then fulfill and what obligations do we have? The answer you can see here. So because the sales are to end consumers, we do have the role of producer in this case. Because we sell under our own brand, even if we buy the packaging from somewhere else, we have the obligation of manufacturer. And technically the criteria for distributor apply, but because we already fulfill the role of manufacturer, this becomes irrelevant because we would check ourselves essentially. I hope this makes the roles a little bit more clear for you. We have also included slides with more detailed definitions, which I will skip over now, but you can check those when you receive the slides after the webinar. The last thing I want to provide to you is this checklist. You can also find this in a bit more detail in our PPWR guide, but this is really the most essential things to note and how to decide if you are fulfilling any of these roles. What is important to add here is that there are exceptions for micro enterprises if they have less than 10 employees and a turnover under 2 million euros. What they are exempt from is the manufacturer obligations. So even if a small business sells under their own brand, they do not have to file a declaration of conformity, for example. And with that being said, I think I will hand over the word to Tiana to present some other important articles of the PPWR.
Yes, thank you, Ben. So now that we understand the key roles of the PPWR, we're going to talk about the articles, so the obligations those roles have to fulfill. And we differentiated those articles into 3 categories for you to make it a little bit more understandable. So first of all, we're going to talk about reusing things, then reducing packaging, and then recycling material. We're going to start by talking about reusing. So the goal of reusable systems is, of course, to promote circular systems, so packaging will not end up as being wasted. What does it actually mean if something is reusable? Of course, it can be used multiple times, as the name already suggests, but it also needs to be a functional reuse system that is already in place in the country where you want to send your packaging to. And the packaging itself must meet some necessary requirements. For example, it must be somehow cleanable or traceable through a QR code or something similar. In the PPWR, the EU is, for example, talking about banning certain single-use plastics, for example, for food and drink consumed on site. So reusable items will need to take over those roles. And in Article 11, there's a minimum number of reuses for standard reusable packaging explained. And what that means is that if you already have reusable packaging, for example, we're going to get into transport packaging in a second, then you have a minimum requirement of how much percentage of your system must be reusable. So transport and sales packaging is very relevant for B2B sellers. You use a lot of pallets and plastic boxes in those areas. And by 2030, you will be asked to have 40% of your system as a reusable system. From 2040, that will go up to 70%. When we're talking about group packaging, that will go from 10 to 25%, and then packaging for beverage will be separately calculated, and there it will go from 10 to 40%, which will count for manufacturers as well as brands. A practical example where we all see this is going to be in the HoReCa sector. There's a special article about that in the PPWR. So in hotels and restaurants and coffee shops, we will all see this new rule being established in practice. But now we're going to get into the second topic, which is reducing. The goal here is to minimize packaging quantities and also pollution, because the PPWR focuses here on material. And in Article 5, they're talking about substance restriction, which will apply immediately. So there will be a limit of the usage of heavy metals. For example, lead and mercury altogether are only allowed at maximum 100 milligram per kilogram of packaging material. And PFAS, which are industrial chemistries, are going to be banned in food packaging in general. In other packages, they're going to be limited. If you come into contact with PFAS packaging at any point in your supply chain, you will have reporting obligations, which means that you will have to have documents about the usage of those PFAS ready at any point, no matter if you get it from your manufacturer, if you supply someone else with it, or distribute it through the EU. Then in the articles 10 and 24 till 25, the PPWR is explaining packaging minimization. So they want to strictly minimize volume and weight, especially white space. So white space, also called empty space, is whatever part of the packaging is not occupied by the product. By 2030, at least half of the box, so 50% of your packaging, must be occupied by the product, and the rest is allowed to be filled with filling material. This is to prohibit misleading packaging, such as double floors or false walls, and everything that has no functional necessity will not be permitted anymore. Of course, in order to find out what is functional necessary, what is actually allowed, we will have to calculate empty space, and those calculations will be defined by 2028. So we will have more numbers there. There will probably also be different numbers for sales and transport packaging again, as we just saw in the reusable systems. Now that we already named quite a few changes, I want to point out some advantages that you can gain by following those changes. So as a company, you will reduce your material usage, therefore your costs for your materials, and also for your storage and shipping. And ultimately, your EPR fees will be smaller because you pay your EPR fees per kilogram of packaging. So that will definitely be more cost efficient. There will also be some advantages for the customer. So for every one of us in this role, we will have lighter packaging. There will be a smaller footprint, which might lead to feeling better with e-commerce in general. And there will be less environmental impact through this, which will be an important part also of branding and advertisement. We cannot talk about less environmental impact if we don't talk about recycling, of course. So the goal here is to design packaging in such a way that it can be effectively recycled in a high quality way. What that means is that as little of the material gets lost or wasted as somehow possible. And in Article 6, the PPWR states the principles of this recyclability, which will start by 2030. So by 2030, those recyclability grades that you see on the picture below will be very, very relevant. And category D, which is every packaging that is less than 70% recyclable, will not be allowed to be put on the European market anymore. By 2038, every packaging that is precisely 70% recyclable, so category C, will also not be permitted anymore. So the PPWR is aiming to get packaging on the market that is 80% or more recyclable. And here again, there will be calculations published about this, which will of course include the collection systems, the sorting systems in each country, the infrastructure, and also the recycling rates of different materials.